askreddit. Doctors of Reddit. What was the most shocking case of "oh, I thought that was normal" you've seen in a patient? When I was a student, we visited a clinic in the country where I studied. Lots of people get horrible injuries and use the local elixir of dirt, motor oil, spit from the local old lady to patch up an exposed arm bone, or whatever. Had one woman in her 20s come in with a fungating breast cancer that looked like a hard mushroom, mold growing through the skin and to the outside world, constantly bled any time you touched it. Her family shamed any injuries or impurities, and she thought she just needed to keep it covered until it got better. Unfortunately, I have seen this on 2 occasions. Both at hospitals that were in middle to upper class communities here in the US. One was a 40-year-old woman, a successful business owner and fully insured. Her sister made her go to the ER because she's COCP. She was asked to put on a gown for an EKG. I will never forget the sight or odor of her breast. It literally looked like green hamburger. Sadly, she did not seek care sooner because she said she was embarrassed by the appearance and later the odor. I followed her care as best I could. She went through bilateral mastectomy, radiation TX, and chemo. She survived another 3 months of hell before she passed away. The second patient was a 28-year-old mother of 2. No insurance and had to work to feed her family. She was seen for a CO neck pain. Physical exam, X-ray revealed both breasts to be full of tumor. I know she had a double mastectomy and I lost track of her for some time. Approximately 2 years later, I ran into her at our kids' gymnastics meet. She was in remission and doing really well. Takeaway, ladies, guys too, please do your self-breast exams. Seek care ASAP if something feels off. When I was a medical student, a patient and his brother came in together. Patient was just a post-op visit after a hernia repair. Found out he had another, baseball-sized hernia. His brother, on the other hand, had literally had a football-sized hernia visibly coming out of his left leg of his shorts. Looked like an inguinal hernia, and he was able to use it as an armrest. I asked him if that bothered him at all, and he straight up said my brother's hernias were painful but this isn't, so I thought it was just a quirky defect. I hope he was lying to save face, but we recommended he get it taken care of. This must be more common than I thought. When I was 10 years old, I had a hernia that pushed my intestines down into my balls. It looked bad, but I honestly didn't feel a thing. I told my mom right away because I'm not the sort to ignore things, and the doctor was astonished I wasn't in severe pain. They actually waited 2 months to fix it so I could finish 5th grade and have the surgery in summer because my pain was a 0. Bonus, because of this we finally figured out about 20% of the nerves in my body don't work, which explained a lot of issues I'd had before, and we figured out I need at least triple doses of anesthetic to be put under or have pain dulled. My body is awesome, but deeply weird. MD here. A couple years back, had a walk-in complaining of a few months of abdo pain, swelling. I shit you not, the man was Simpson's character yellow with jaundice and ascites, fluid filling the belly. He seemed shocked when I told him I was calling the hospital to arrange direct admission. Please continue. ER nurse here. Guy probably went to the ER where they probs did a CT scan of his abdomen and pelvis. Probably did a paracentesis, removal of abdominal fluid using a needle, to reduce his abdominal swelling. Blood tests to check liver enzymes, electrolytes, blood counts to check for infection, and also, acetaminophen, Tylenol, level to check for toxicity. A thorough history to check for excessive alcohol consumption which may cause liver cirrhosis. Agree with other poster who said liver failure is a long circling of the drain. A brutal death I wouldn't wish on an enemy of mine. I don't know if this fits, but here's a story about my husband. We were messing around and he chased me through the kitchen, took a hard left turn and lost his footing. Fell on his side. He's a big dude, so falling is a bit more traumatic for him. He couldn't put pressure on his leg and knew immediately he was hurt pretty bad. He was able to crawl to the couch, and once settled said he wasn't in too much pain. He decided to sleep on the couch that night so he wouldn't have to go upstairs. We made an appointment in the morning for the ER so we wouldn't have to sit there all day, but they didn't have an opening until 2, so we just hung out at the house. He was in a decent amount of ambient pain, but it didn't seem emergent. Once we got to the hospital, we find out that he had broken his hip, in this case breaking off his entire ball joint from the top of his femur. The nurses said they couldn't believe that he was able to sit up and had slept on it, implying that we should have come the night before, and probably by ambulance. It required surgery with some hefty bolts to put it back into place. But the crazy part is that apparently a healthy 30-ish-year-old man breaking his femur from standing is highly unusual. After several tests and an MRI, it turned out he was in the early stages of osteoporosis due to a pituitary tumor in his brain. So we discovered a benign brain tumor all because dude was wearing slippery socks. Edited to correct the type of tumor. I had the wrong gland. MD here. Patient came in saying he was feeling a little tired and noticed he was having a harder time doing his job in construction, a particularly difficult type of construction. Turns out he had slowly lost 80% of his blood over the course of a few months. Dude was a badass to be working as hard and long as he was with only a fifth of normal blood volume. Hemoglobin was low 2s. ERMD here. Had a patient come in for cast removal literally years after it had been put on. She had just decided it wasn't worth taking off. Her leg skin was literally growing over the top of the cast and then down it. Once we finally cut the cast off, she was surprised to find that she had no skin underneath, but the dead tissue over her muscles and bones was being cleaned by about 300 maggots. I knew by the smell that something under there wasn't right, but wasn't expecting that. Patient seemed completely fine with it. Whatever. Edit. I've got tons more of these stories. That was just the first one that came to mind. This one was actually from back when I was a medical student, but it's still the weirdest thing I've seen. Sorry this is long, but I promise it's worth it. It was my last rotation of medical school before graduating and starting residency. I had completed all my requirements and just wanted to take a few interesting electives of things I hadn't seen yet. This was a dermatology rotation at the Virginia. The rotation had been interesting and chill, and it was my last day, and my third to last patient as a medical student. The guy came in, and the resident asked him why he was there, and he said I have hair coming out of my hand. I figured he meant a weird mole with some hair coming out. But this guy, prob late 30s or early 40s, says no, the hair is coming out from under the skin. The resident asked what he does for a living, and he says he's a barber. The resident tells me that it's not too uncommon for hair to poke through the skin, especially for barbers who cut men's hair. It's short, thin, and can be kinda pocky after all, and it was sort of like getting a sliver, but with hair. But the guy says, no, it's a lot of hair, look. And he holds up his hand, making a fist, and there's several hairs poking out from between the knuckles of his pointer and middle finger. I stare in confusion, and the derm resident grabs some tweezers and pulls out a tweezer full, maybe a half dozen, of short black hairs. The guy says, yeah, I already pulled out like 50. The derm resident was like 50. So the derm resident numbs up the back side of his hand between the first and second knuckle, and makes a little incision, and starts pulling out gobs of short black hair. Chunk of 20, chunk of 30, etc. And now she's got the magnifying glasses on and the attached light and she like, oh my gosh, there's still more in there. Sir, do you know how all this hair got into your hand? And the guy goes, oh, it probably came in through the... And he flips his hand over to reveal a hole in the palmar aspect of his hand's skin. Turns out the dude had cut himself like 2 years before this, and it had never healed properly. He was diabetic, and he just kept cutting hair with this open wound on his hand. And probably every day a few hairs got stuck in his hand. For 2 years. and now those hairs had tunneled through the webbing between his first and second fingers from the front of his hand and out the back side. Long story already, sorry. The poor resident spent like 30 minutes milking his hand and fingers while more and more hair came out. She said there's no way I got it all out. You have to come back every 2 weeks for a few months for us to keep removing more hair from your hand. Which is a weird sentence. In the meantime, wear gloves while you cut hair. We gave the dude a whole box of latex gloves. I don't remember anything about my last 2 patients that day. It was literally my last day as a student, and boy, what a way to go out. Still probably the weirdest thing I've ever seen, not to mention how there's some hair in my hand. Happens, I guess the guy was about it. Patient with cancer, SCC, of their finger. It ate the entire fingernail, the nail bed, tip of the finger. Probably a year of growth. Eventually got them to let me see under their band-aid at the cut that wouldn't heal. They had no fingernail. Had to scrape the bone BC, the cancer grew so deep. We had a guy come in with a coal black melanoma that was over 1 centimeter thick, mostly sticking out of the skin, and 3 or 4 centimeters wide. In news that will surprise no one, he had metastases and not much time to live. Resident Doctor here, although not an OB/GYN. In my OB/GYN rotation in medical school, I had a patient who was a first-time mother having difficulty nursing her baby. The patient said she had some redness and it had been hurting to nurse on one nipple, so she often had to switch until finally it became unbearable for her to nurse from either. She had mentioned that she thought her nipples might be cracked or chafed. When it finally came to the exam, she had the most chafed nipples I had ever seen. It looked totally raw and macerated to the point that they looked like 2 large pepperoni slices. One of her breasts also looked like the wound had led to mastitis. It definitely led to a new appreciation of how difficult breastfeeding can be on new mothers. Not a doctor but have a story. My oldest son was 11 years old and needed a physical for youth tackle football. We had a new doctor, so she went into more detail than most physicals. He had complained that his ankle hurt during the middle of baseball season, so she asked if he could take off his shoe. When he did, she immediately points to the side of his foot where there was a strange bump and informed us he had a broken foot. I didn't believe her as I pointed out he had the same thing on his other foot as well. She took a look and said, "Oh, he has 2 broken feet," and sent us over to get x-rays from the hospital. I was laughing, thinking this was so crazy, believing there was no way my son, who not only finished playing in a baseball tournament, but who was running and jumping at the swimming pool literally an hour before, had 2 broken feet. After the x-rays were completed, my smile quickly faded as the doctor was right. That is when we learned about completely flat feet and the damage stress fractures can do when they go undetected. 8 weeks of cast and special shoes and insoles for the rest of his life solved the problem. His feet are still deformed, but it never slowed him down. Patient here. Went to the doctor for a note to have a day off work since I didn't feel great and just didn't want to work. Doctor poked me in the stomach, said that's not normal, and sent me off to have a scan. Which took me 2 months to get around to. 2 weeks later I get a letter from the doctors asking me to come in. Change my shifts, so I go, and the doctor went off at me for not coming in sooner and told me to go home and pack a bag. I'm off to the Royal Brisbane. It might be cancer. More scans later and it's decided that it's not cancer. It was a 4 kilograms cyst. My only symptom was an enlarged stomach and the "you're getting fat" comments from my mother. Not a doctor, but a patient. I went in for hip pain. I couldn't lie on that leg for more than 30 seconds without pain. I thought it was muscular and my doctor thought it might be radiating back pain. I had several x-rays and learned I had broken my hip sometime in the past, had a floating bone chip in my hip, degenerative disc disease, a birth defect in my spine, and mild scoliosis. Work at a dentist's office. Patient presents for an exam. Concerned part of her tooth has chipped off. On examination, it is not in fact a tooth that chipped off, but rather a piece of calculus, which is buildup of hard tartar that covers your teeth over time when you don't brush them. It can be small deposits, or in this case, an entire bridge covering her actual teeth. She thought the calculus was tooth material and was quite shocked to learn we were actually unable to see her real teeth and she'd need an extensive cleaning to remove it all. Quote, a piece of calculus, unquote. I knew my suspicion that math was unhealthy was justified. I'm making my internship and one night I was attending a triage at ER. Triage is the area where you check the patients and decide how urgent is the attention they need. Context here, I'm in a third world country and I'm at a public hospital that attends uncovered population, and instead of one hospital with all the specialities we have three, the main one, the Geo Hospital, and the Children's Hospital. So I had this woman of late 30s, she started telling me that she had an extreme pain, 10/10, in the lower abdomen, no other sign that food could be involved, neither kidney stones or urine infection. I proceed to ask about last menstrual cycle. She doesn't recall the exact date, but she says that was like 4 months ago. Without hesitation and without asking more or anything else, I told them, she and her familiar, to go right away to the hospital that was crossing the street, because if it was something obstetric we didn't have any Geo in this hospital, and if it was something of general surgery they had general surgeons there. We got a call like 20 minutes later. Lol, that woman delivered her baby at triage of the other hospital. Healthcare worker here. I ran into a patient who had one or possibly both heads of her biceps completely ruptured proximally and curled back on itself so she looked like Popeye. I sheepishly asked her about it and she just shrugged and said it didn't hurt so she didn't worry about it. You do have 3 muscles that flex the elbow. But still the biceps is pretty important. I'm not a doctor, but I did used to work in the emergency department of a pretty big hospital. This one lady came in with complications with her pregnancy. Apparently, a lot of things were going wrong, but she just thought that was part of pregnancy until someone pointed out to her it was not. It turns out she had a miscarriage. That was not a fun day. You never forget the cry of a mother who has just lost a child. I literally wrote off an entire kidney stone episode as being due to my pregnancy. I started having some pretty intense flank pain on my right side and blamed sleeping on my side. Then I started having some migrating right side pain down into my groin. Blamed the baby moving around. This devolved into heavy pressure downer which I just blamed on my baby getting heavier at 26 weeks. No biggie. Same with needing to pee every 5 minutes without fail, totally just me being pregnant and hydrating. Throughout all this I was extremely uncomfortable but wrote it all off with the exception of some spotting which was actually me peeing blood due to the stone that the doc told me to just go on pelvic rest for. About 30 minutes before passing the stone, the situation went from wow I'm super uncomfortable to my pain being a 9/10. It feels like glass shards are being rubbed into my freaking vagina, my back is flaming and I'm screaming from the sudden onset and pain. Before we left to go to the hospital because I thought I was in some sort of labor I went to pee and passed the stone and immediately felt much better. Pregnancy is a ride. Psychiatrist here. One of my first patients was a female college student that couldn't sleep because of the voices that constantly talked to her and she felt forced to answer them at all times. From what she was saying I gathered that depending on the particular voice, with name and identity, she was either cautioned about some people or situations or outright pushed towards violent acts. Her voices appeared when she was 16 if I remember correctly, and we've met when she was 20. So at that point for 4 years of her life she believed that it was normal to have such voices in your head, because, as she explained, many people talk to themselves. To some extent she was right, but I had to explain to her that they really talk with themselves, that there are no other identities in them, but only an internal dialogue to clarify or resolve issues that bother them in their own privacy, so to speak. She was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. MD here. I had a patient that had such uncontrolled diabetes that he lost all sensation in his legs. He came into the hospital because he saw some blood on his socks when taking them off. Turns out his foot was literally rotting off, almost completely gangrenous, and the blood was coming from a huge ulcer at the bottom of his foot, which had maggots living in it. Not a fun day. Patient thought I was dehydrated after a stomach bug. Called the doc and was frustrated. They recommended the ER in case I needed 4 fluids. Left work mid-morning and told my boss I'd be back after lunch. ER did a CT scan and turns out it wasn't the stomach flu. I'd had an ovarian cyst rupture and had a grapefruit-sized massive internal bleeding, clotting, and was anemic to the point they talked transfusion. I was admitted for emergency surgery to remove the blood and stop the bleeding. They also removed my left ovary, which pathology showed had torsion. Not a doctor but related story of major illness undetected. My son, 13 complained to me that his scrotum was unbearably itchy. I figured probably sweat, told him to wash the area thoroughly and make sure to dry well, maybe dust some baby powder on the too. A couple of days later he said it was still itchy and getting bigger. Bigger? He showed me his visibly swollen scrotum. No pain or anything, just itchy and swollen. So that's not good, but I didn't think it was anything more than a sweat rash that maybe needed some ointment. We go to the doctor and are sent off for an ultrasound. The scan shows 0 blood flow to the area, immediate transfer to the emergency room. He goes in for emergency surgery where the urologist surgeon removes one necrotic testicle. It had become randomly twisted, testicular torsion, and died, at least a week prior according to its necrotic state. The swelling was a major infection setting in. The itchiness was caused by the infection and skin stretching. He had no pain whatsoever and the doctor said that was amazing. For most boys, torsion feels like being kicked in the nuts continuously, and by the infected stage he was in, he'd expect crying and screaming level of pain. Much longer and he could have developed sepsis. We just thought it was a bit of a rash that got out of hand and are lucky I took him to the GP and didn't just go by ointment OTC as I had thought of doing. He had a follow-up surgery a month later to insert a fake testicle and to stitch his remaining live testicle to the scrotum wall so it can't commit seppuku like its brother.